there, political orphans. Welcome to another special edition election countdown of Lost in the Middle. It's going to be an interesting conversation today. As you may recall, those of you who listen to the show regularly, I sort of have the entire axis of evil covered. So I spent 14 years as a journalist, then 8 years in Congress, then about 20 years as a lobbyist. So whichever of those professions you hate the most, you can blame me. Whichever ones of them you like, I'll also take all the credit for it. Sort of a quick story to get into this before we talk to Isaac Saul, who's our guest today, who's created, I think, one of the most interesting new news publications in the country. And we're going to talk about the media and its role in the current elections, then also catch up on some battleground areas. Isaac's from Pennsylvania, lives in Philadelphia, went to school in Pittsburgh. And it may be that Pennsylvania is the linchpin of this entire election because the path for the Democrats get really tough if they lose it. And even if Trump loses it, it's going to be a very complicated run for him because he's got to sort of sweep the rest of the states that are on the tables. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about journalism these days and some of the challenges the industry faces. And I think a lot of the economic challenges are actually what's, I think, driving what it seems to me, and Isaac may disagree with this, driving sort of a tendency now to go left or right because it's the only way you can get paid subscribers. So I've joked, if you listen to one of my earlier episodes on how the media lost its way, that it all went to hell in about 1994 when somebody bought a used Oldsmobile on Craigslist. And people look at me strangely when I tell that story. But the fact is, starting in 1994, classified advertisings disappeared from American newspapers, which were about 40% of the revenue. For those of you who aren't old timers, once upon a time you'd get a paper dropped on your porch on a Sunday morning, and in it would come about 3 sections of classified advertising, which is where you bought dogs, sold dogs, bought a car, sold a car, looked for a job, real estate ads, buying, selling, whatever. And that went kablooey. And then the next thing, right about the timing's great for the newspaper industry, along comes the internet and everybody says, oh, we'll just put everything up online for free. And now nobody will pay for it. So if you look around the country, I meant the number of newspaper deserts is staggering. So then you have to look what's happening with the cable industry today because everybody's cutting cable, especially cutting the cord, especially anybody under 30, which makes it really hard to make money in the cable business. You can see it in the sports industry where, one of the largest providers of local sports programming just went completely belly up. And this week, the Milwaukee Brewers find themselves with the Guardians and a number of other teams where they're going to be broadcast on Peacock or they may be broadcast on Major League Baseball. And so if you're running a television news operation, same thing. The only people who pay were the folks who are sort of on the extremes in both parties. And that's why what my guest has done is so intriguing. So Isaac actually started a news operation years ago. It's bare bones, but I think does some of the best coverage in the country, the most balanced coverage in the country. And it's already got about 125,000 subscribers, which a lot of local news operations would die for these days. So, Isaac, welcome to the show. And tell me, as we sort of kick this off, your traditional journalism background.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me, Scott. I'm glad to be here. I have a pretty, familiar story, I think, for a lot of people in the media, at least in the early ages of my career. I got my start actually in high school in a media class that my old teacher, Mr. Al Wilson, taught, and we ran a little local channel that covered issues at the high school, which was a bunch of kids basically impersonating real news anchors. And it was good fun and good training and made me like the craft a lot. And I went to the University of Pittsburgh out in Western Pennsylvania. And then I worked for the school newspaper there. And I majored in nonfiction writing with a journalism track. There was no J school at Pitt. So, my experience was really doing the work. I was the sports editor for the school paper, big Division I school. And I got opportunities to shadow, local reporters from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette or ESPN or wherever else, and work for a couple dailies and a couple weeklies as interns. And then when I graduated college, I actually spent some time abroad. I lived in Israel for about 6 months and started applying for jobs back home, writing about my experiences in the Middle East. And so my first job was actually at the Huffington Post, which, no surprise, has quite the liberal lean. And I like to tell people, I didn't start working there because I was a bleeding heart liberal. I worked there because I applied for 50 jobs and only one place gave me an interview, and it was them. And it's hard to get a job in media, man. So yeah, I took the gig, and I think that was my very first job in media. And I got to see how the sausage was made at a kind of, a news outlet that had a very obvious, overt political slant, which was informative for me. And then I worked all over. I started a media company with Ashton Kutcher. I've written for Time Magazine, for Vox, for Independent Journal Review, which is a conservative magazine. I've kind of spanned the gamut, freelanced a bunch. And about 5 years ago, I decided that things seemed really broken and I didn't like how it was working. So I went out on my own to start Tangle.
I'm going to take you down a strange little detour for a minute. So the woman who was my last press secretary in office had actually worked for Mike Huffington, who was Ariana Huffington's husband, who was an oil heir. I don't remember which oil company it was, which I suspect is where part of the money came from to start it. And here's interesting is that she's married to a very conservative congressman from California, gets divorced, and then takes a hard turn left. Did you have any interaction with her at all personally?
Yeah, I saw her around the office. She was actually quite good at kind of, being present and trying to meet people and talk to people. I mean, when I got there, they were doing really well. So it was still a huge newsroom. I mean, hundreds of people in this New York office. I remember very vividly, this was at an era where all of the stuff she was preaching about work-life balance was being put into practice in a lot of places. So we had yoga classes, in the middle of the workday at 11 o'clock, which as a 23-year-old reporter, I obviously took advantage of. And one day I opened my eyes from like this deep breath meditation and sat up, and she was sitting right next to me. She had come in the middle of the class, and we talked a bit. But yeah, and interestingly enough, I mean, a kind of a story that's been told in different parts of the media, but lots of rumors or maybe even, some contextual evidence too that her politics were not particularly aligned with the politics of the news outlet. She saw it more as a business opportunity and saw a space that could be filled rather than somebody who is acting on her own ideological beliefs. Yeah, I have no insight into whether that was true or not, but it is an interesting little curveball in the story there.
So, before we leave that, when you were there, it was obvious to you that it had tilted. Do you think the same thing was going on if you'd go back and look at the Pittsburgh Press-Gazette at that time or the Philadelphia Inquirer, or they were still trying to do it the old-fashioned way where you told both sides of the story?
I think what was clear with the Huffington Post was that it had an ideological worldview tilted toward the left that determined, how it framed headlines, what stories it decided to cover, the people it quoted in the story, and what elements of the story it focused on. I mean, the way that I talk about this often is, if a immigrant comes here to the United States illegally and starts a business that turns into a multi-million-dollar company, you can bet everything you own that the New York Times is going to cover that story. If an immigrant comes here illegally and gets drunk and kills somebody in a car accident, you can bet every dollar you own that Fox News is going to cover that story. And there's selection bias in how these news outlets choose what they're going to cover. And so one of the ways Huffington Post sort of expressed this bias, I think, was covering a lot of stories that reflected the ideological worldview that existed in the newsroom. Places like the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and Philadelphia Inquirer, I think, had a different challenge. I mean, certainly a number of reporters there, probably the majority of reporters there, had ideological leanings to the left. I think that's true more at Philadelphia Inquirer than Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. But their reporters do a lot of really fair work, in my opinion, at least traditionally, the people on the straight news team. The challenge they have is that these big newsrooms they used to be big newsrooms. They've, gotten gutted in the last decade or two. But the Inquirer and the Post-Gazette, they have editorial boards. And in the case of the Inquirer, a lot of their opinion writers and their editorials they publish express a liberal worldview, which is a really big challenge for the news team because they often get bucketed into that. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette traditionally, I think, is closer to the center than the Philadelphia Inquirer, certainly than the Huffington Post. I'm not sure what the lean of their editorial board or opinion section tends to be these days, but at least when I was in college, I would say they were not very predictable, and they kind of reflected the politics of the region, which is really all over the place.
We're going to talk as soon as we get back from the break in a couple of minutes about how you actually got your operation started. But I think you pointed out something important that my impression is, and my firm belief is, that reporters on the beat tell it fair. I don't think people who work for the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal are making stuff up as they go. But the secret sauce is what the editor gives you, because of the slant of the story going in drives the narrative, right?
Yeah, I think something a lot of people misunderstand, regular news consumers, is like, the writers don't make the headlines. We don't decide what gets cut. We don't determine, what the lead or the angle of the story is. Typically, you write a draft of a piece and you bring it to your editors, and then there's these 1, 2, 3, 4 levels of people who outrank you, who get to push back and reconstruct your piece and tell you what they think the angle of the story is. And that's a really big challenge as a reporter who, ends up with their name on the story when editors are kind of doing a lot of the work in the background. And it's certainly true, in my opinion, that a lot of the big mainstream reporters that we have are pretty fair by the book people. But sometimes their work is, reflected or pushed out into the space after an editorial touch that can push it in one direction or the other.
Yeah, I'll give one quick example I always think of is when some school board sits there and has to figure out the cuts, right? And so it turns into this litany of, we're going to end music programs, we're going to end all the sports teams, kids won't have food in the cafeterias, instead of saying, wait a minute, your administrative staff is 4 times what it was 10 years ago. And that's the sort of stuff that drives me crazy, because the narratives become so predictable. They're oftentimes just meaningless cliches. But we'll be back to talk more about your own story and how you launched your news service in just a minute, right after this.
This podcast is brought to you by the American Property Owners Alliance. Our country recognizes homeownership as one of the best ways to build wealth and stable communities. But over the years, support for homeownership has dwindled, and our leaders have lost sight of its value. We're working to change that. The American Property Owners Alliance is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that holds our leaders accountable to safeguard homeowners and communities. Visit propertyownersalliance.org to learn more and find out how you can join our efforts.
Hey, welcome back. We're talking to Isaac Saul, who I think's got one of the most interesting journalism operations in the country. Effective, unbiased, and tiny. So talk to me, Isaac, about how you woke up one day and said, I got to do this on my own.
Yeah, I like to say I sort of have 2 genesis stories. The first is that I grew up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which is a bellwether county and a bellwether state that often determines the outcome of presidential elections. So I just have a lot of people in my life, my family, old teachers, classmates, teammates, whatever it is, who span the political spectrum. And I spend a lot of time sharing space with these people, diehard MAGA bros and lefty Bernie bros and everybody in between. And when I came into the media industry, I recognized that a lot of people, to the right of the political spectrum, a lot of the people I grew up with were not really represented in some of these spaces. And I also saw reasons for and understood why people from the left might criticize the way the media approaches certain issues. And amidst this, I, really wanted to find a place where I could go deep on specific policy related questions with a really wide spectrum of views about those questions. So, for example, when Trump's proposing his border wall, if I want to understand the best arguments for and against the border wall, I can't just read the New York Times because I won't get the strongest conservative arguments about why a border wall might work. What I have to do is I have to read the New York Times straight news team, then I have to read the New York Times editorial board, then I have to read the Wall Street Journal, then their editorial board, then I need to go listen to a Ben Shapiro podcast and watch some Tucker Carlson, and then turn on Pod Save America or listen to NPR. And, after hours of doing all of this, I could sit down and say, you know what? I think I have a really good grasp of all the different views about this issue from the far left to the far right and everybody in between. And now I understand the arguments. Why doesn't this just exist in one place? Like, why can't I just go to one place to get this? And that was the initial concept for the newsletter. And what I built was, let's just bring all these views under one roof, just show them to people and let folks make up their mind about what resonates with them, what seems like the strongest argument. And so Tangle to me was the kind of embodiment of this exercise that I was doing on my own as someone who is just curious and politically moderate and wanting to understand the world. And I figured if I want this, there's got to be a lot of other people out there who want it too. I mean, I wasn't confident launching it because I know how powerful partisan media is, and I figured it was going to be hard to get people to read and engage arguments they didn't like. But it turned out I was right. There are a lot of people who want this. And, we have over 140,000 people on our mailing list now, and we have a YouTube channel and a podcast and an audience that is really engaged and really cares about what we're doing. And I think we're punching above our weight in a lot of ways.
How do you drive subscribers? Where do they come from? How do they find you?
Yeah. So in the early days, I mean, I've been doing this for 5 years now. I would say the first 3.5 years, it was 90% word of mouth. So we would make it really easy for people to share the newsletter. We would ask them to share it. We would do, drives where if somebody sent us a screenshot of them texting the newsletter to a friend, we'd enter their name in a raffle and we'd give out, merchandise and stuff like that. Over the years, as our subscriptions have grown and we've started to make money and built this kind of sustainable business, I've started spending money on advertisements. The most successful ads that we buy are typically advertising in other news outlets that are summarizing the news in kind of short form, typically neutral, unbiased ways where we can say, hey, if you want to go more in depth on these topics and get a better understanding of the arguments, come subscribe to our newsletter. We also have success subscribing or advertising, in overt conservative and liberal spaces. And we do that differently. If I'm advertising in a conservative space, I'll say, I'm a political journalist who agrees that the media is broken and I've built this solution. Come join us and see what we're all about. And if I'm advertising in a liberal space, I might say, are you struggling to understand why your uncle would vote for Donald Trump? Here's a newsletter that gives you the best arguments that are coming from across the political spectrum on big divisive issues. And that typically resonates, respectively with those sides and brings people in. And that's been a really good growth metric for us, is just telling people exactly what we're doing, maybe framing it a little bit differently depending on the audience. But there's an appetite for people who want to understand different political views and challenge their own thinking. I mean, believe it or not, there are a lot of Americans out there who actually want to do that.
So one of the segments in our story about the media was about All Sides, which is a nonprofit, which essentially was founded by guys who came out of the internet industry thinking the internet would bring people together, and instead found out what it did is it actually drives people to whatever their own bizarre rabbit holes are. So All Sides, if you're not familiar with this, and you go on their website, basically rates media outlets from left to right. So the New York Times, not surprisingly, is left. The Wall Street Journal is slightly right. But there are very few who sort of get high marks for being dead center. And Isaac, you're one of them. And do you appreciate that sort of confirmation?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, look, I was a little bit nervous when All Sides was gonna do a rating. They reached out to us and said, "Hey, we're doing an audit of your website. Just want to let you know, if you have any context or anything you want to add, information on the site about how you guys were founded and that sort of thing." And I was confident, but they're a big name in the industry, and I think when people look up the bias of a news outlet, they're one of the first results that came up. And yeah, I mean, to me, there were two things that were really affirming about their rating and the audit they did of our work. One was that they said we were center, which, we want to be impartial and neutral and balanced. We share opinions explicitly, and I share my opinion in the newsletter, and I'm not shy about how I feel about certain things, but I still want it to be seen as like a holistic, impartial, balanced space. And then the other thing is that they gave us really high marks for sharing information that was factual and analysis that was, based in reality. They understood that we weren't just elevating nonsense from the left or the right. So I was very appreciative of the rating and super proud of where it came out. And I think, we have one of the things that makes us most unique, I think, in my opinion, is that we have readers who are politically diverse themselves. So about a third of our audience is conservative, about a third is liberal, and about a third says they're independent or identifies as, something other than liberal or conservative. And that's a really powerful reflection of the work that we're putting out. And I think it's proof that we can bring people of all political stripes under one roof.
So that the last group you talked about is our favorite group, independents, right? And people who see themselves as political orphans. And it's the group right now that's about to decide the election. And they keep getting a little bit smaller and a little bit smaller. But if you look at those battleground states now, and so, for example, I just read an analysis of Wisconsin. About a month ago, it was 14% of the voters. Now it's down to about 5%. And I don't know the track for Pennsylvania, but I'm willing to bet it's pretty close, as it will be in Michigan and in Georgia and in Nevada and in Arizona and Michigan. So when we come back, one of the things I want to talk about, Isaac, is your impressions of the race at this point. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about the presidential debates, talk a little bit about just press coverage in general, and then I want to get your insights in Pennsylvania, because I keep telling everybody, if you want to figure out where the election's going, buy popcorn, stay up late. You're going to watch those trucks roll in from Pennsylvania because they have the same issue we have in Wisconsin about counting absentee ballots. That'll be part of the story, and we'll be back in just a minute. Here's the team behind Lost in the Middle. Executive producer Jeff Mayers. Producer Todd Elbaugh. Edited by Aaron Zummers. Production at Civic Media. And a quick thanks to our partners at the American Property Owners Alliance. Hey, so welcome back, political orphans, and thanks for joining us on this special election countdown issue of Lost in the Middle. This is episode number 3 with Isaac Saul, who's the curator, editor, driver, probably carries around the monkey wrench, fills up the water cooler and the copying machine, because welcome to small business. But I want to talk to him now in his role as a Pennsylvania native. He grew up in Bucks County, went to school in Pittsburgh. So what is it about Pennsylvania that makes it so swingy?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because today in our kind of political dynamics that we exist in, the most reliable indicator of how people are going to vote is no longer things like, race or geography necessarily. It's education and, in some respects, socioeconomics. And what Pennsylvania has is a lot of diversity among those groups, especially counties like Bucks County, where I'm from.
And explain to people who don't know a Pennsylvania map where Bucks County is.
Sure, yeah. Bucks County is the county just north of Philadelphia. And it encompasses this really wide range of voters. So a lot of, working class white voters who are typically associated with Donald Trump, a lot of highly educated, well-off suburbanites, and a lot of voters of color who are living sort of just on the outskirts of Philadelphia. And so the way that a county like this goes is typically pretty indicative of how the election's going to go. And it's not necessarily who wins. In the last few elections, Democrats have actually won bucks repeatedly. Hillary Clinton won it, Barack Obama won it the last 2 times he ran, and Joe Biden won it in 2020. What's really important is the margin. If it's, something like 0 to 1.5%, that's going to be a really good sign for Donald Trump. If Kamala Harris wins it by, more like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7%, that's probably a good sign for her prospects in the election. And if she loses it, then I would bet that Trump is not just going to win Pennsylvania, but will win the election as a whole. So it's a very interesting place in terms of the voters that make it up. And I think the other thing that makes Pennsylvania really swingy is the kind of typical urban and rural divide that we see in politics today. We have 2 big cities, Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, with 2 really big, suburban areas surrounding them, and then a huge swath of rural America. I mean, the joke in Pennsylvania is between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia is Pennsyltucky. I mean, it is open country, rural areas, very conservative voters. And when you're passing through the state, you feel like you're in the South. I mean, the vibe, the culture, everything about it feels that way. And the voters vote that way. So it's a really, really interesting state with a lot of interesting dynamics.
So the one place you didn't talk about is one of the counties everybody points to, which is Erie County on the far western corner of the state. We were talking about sports before we came on taping the podcast, talking about the Eagles and who Isaac likes and who he hates among Pennsylvania teams. But when I was interviewing some people in Erie early on, I said to one guy, so Eagles or are you a Steelers fan? And he just about jumped through the screen and said, have you looked at a map? I'm 20 miles from Cleveland. I'm a Browns fan and I'm a Guardians fan. I hope all the other Pennsylvania teams lose constantly. So push it to the other side of the state. What makes it Erie so weird? Only because it seems to have really a track record of picking the winner.
Yeah, I mean, it's first of all, I'll say the importance of Erie County has not been lost on either candidate in this race. You'll see both of them campaigning there. I believe Kamala Harris is actually out there as we're recording this today, or she went out there this week. The thing about Erie that's really interesting is kind of what you just alluded to there. It's a state that is not far from and regionally distinct from what we consider the Midwest, places like Ohio. Again, it's sort of like it's both a bellwether county and a county that makes you feel like you're in a different part of the country than you'd feel if you were in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. It flipped in the elections, unlike Bucks County, which is, still considered a bellwether county. I think I'm looking this up really quick. In 2016, it went for Trump, and then it went back to Biden. And before that, Barack Obama had won it twice. So it's a county that Trump has won in the past, and it's a county that traditionally passes between the 2 political parties. And it has a lot of importance in, the debates that we're hearing around things like energy and fracking, because it's a part of the country and a part of the state that very much relies on this for, their economic boom. And it's, like Pittsburgh is a place that used to rely on things like steel. And so all these issues that you're hearing about in the debate and in the headlines of the news, Trump's tariffs and whether Kamala Harris is going to ban fracking and all these things, they are relevant for a lot of voters in Western Pennsylvania, a lot of voters in Erie, and a lot of voters in the surrounding counties.
So how, looking back with the Trump-Harris debate, where do you come down on the fact-checking, which leaned heavily against Trump?
It's a really interesting question. So I wrote about this in my newsletter. I thought that the bias of the moderators was overt and a little bit inescapable and quite grating to me, even as somebody who was a political moderate. So I can't imagine what it was like watching that debate as a, diehard Trump supporter and how overt that must have felt. One of the reasons that I think it felt that way is because the way in which Trump lies is a lot more obvious and easy to fact check in real time, partly because he repeats a lot of the same lies over and over, and partly because some of the things he says are so grossly exaggerated that it kind of tees up moderators to, chime in and say, well, actually, it's illegal to murder babies in every state in the United States, which, duh, of course. And he brings that upon himself. But the other issue is that Kamala Harris is a seasoned politician who speaks like a politician, and she tells a lot of mistruths the way traditional slippery politicians do, which requires a little bit of work to understand or to fact check or to be prepared for in real time. And I think the moderators just simply weren't prepared for some of the things that she said or did that were dishonest. And it's a really hard job. I mean, I did a live stream of the debate with my computer out in front of me with an audience of our Tangle readers and Tangle listeners tuned in. And I got to say, it was not easy to just like pause the debate and explain to people what somebody had said just based purely on my memory of the issues, because a lot of the times it's like these very specific, minute statistics or little nuanced ways of saying things that kind of distort reality that politicians rely on. And it's hard. And so I think they had a really hard job. And I think they did the easy thing, which was they fact checked the obvious lies that Trump said. I think Trump lied more in the debate than Harris did. But I think the reason he got fact checked so much wasn't that. It's that he said some things that were so obviously untrue, while Harris lied in a way that was a lot harder to get your hands around and a lot more difficult to fact check in real time.
Yeah, the one thing that I think frustrated me, and I'm not a fan of either of them, I remain one of the shrinking base of double haters, is that, she changed her position on a number of issues, and leading off with fracking. And they sort of said, here are 5 things, or 6, whatever it was, that you changed your position on. And then she said, well, now I support fracking. And they never went back and said, well, wait a minute. And the other question I don't think she ever got in a debate, which is the first thing I would have asked, is to say, so President Biden had to step aside because the party came to the conclusion that he couldn't serve another 4 years. When were you first aware of the fact that he faced challenges? Which is like the $1 zillion question, because either she knew and covered it up or she was pretty blind, and I actually wrote a long column about the New York Times. There's actually a criminal charge called willful blindness. And in willful blindness, the first sort of test case on this was a guy who goes to Mexico and somebody tries to sell him weed. And he said, I don't want to buy any. And they said, okay, well, you take this box across the border if we pay you $200. And he says, sure. So he drives across the border. He gets stopped by the Border Patrol. And they said, hey, what's in the trunk? And he goes, well, I don't know. Well, there's a box in here. Yeah. What's in it? Well, I don't know. And so he said, I had no idea there was marijuana in it. So he gets convicted of federal charges that basically said, you had to know. You're a knucklehead. So with the New York Times, they picked a very visible fight with the Wall Street Journal about what I thought was a well-documented story where the Wall Street Journal said, we've talked to, I don't remember what the number was, 72, 74 people who've been in meetings with Biden or who have reported on meetings from other people about Biden, and he's clearly slipping. And the Times runs this big piece saying, oh, this is Republican talking points, and how can you raise somebody's age as a race? It's actual discriminatory. Then he does the debate, and boom, 4 days later, they say he's got to go. So from my perspective, either you knew and it was inconvenient, or you've got the biggest news bureau in Washington, D.C. How the hell couldn't you see it? Thoughts?
Yeah, it's a really, I thought the Wall Street Journal piece was incredibly convincing. And after the debate, in fact, in the middle of the debate, I tweeted out the Wall Street Journal story again. I'd shared it a few days earlier. And I said, can anybody really watch what's happening right now on stage and tell me that this story is a bunch of made up, anonymous source lies, which it very clearly wasn't when you read the actual story. I mean, they had people on record, but the breadth of their coverage and the number of people they interviewed made it very clear they had the story dead to rights. So, I agree that would have been a great question to ask. I think she has faced very little scrutiny for her flip-flops, and the questions in the debate were not particularly sharp. We saw in the vice presidential debate, actually, I thought an improvement. There was still some overt bias, but at least, Tim Walz got some really tough questions where he embarrassed himself on stage by not being able to answer them, even the obvious ones about, Tiananmen Square and the stories he's been telling and how they don't line up with the record. The other thing I'll just say is like some of the things that Kamala Harris said on stage during the debate were actually predictable lies. I mean, she brought up the bloodbath quote about the economy that Trump had given, that the left has misconstrued and turned into this story like he was threatening political violence. You know, he said that if he didn't win the race, it was going to be a bloodbath, when he was talking about the auto industry was going to face a bloodbath because of, you know, the policies that the Biden administration would bring in. I mean, something like that, the moderator's not stepping in and clarifying that Trump didn't threaten, you know, civil violence, I think is a really clear representation of their own biases and some of the problems that they had in preparing for the debate.
So did you think that overall the Walz-Vance debate was better because there was less harsh rhetoric, or is it just that it was a little bit nicer, but it was still a crappy job of getting the viewpoints out?
I thought the Walz-Vance debate was better because they actually debated policy. I mean, I felt like I was being transported back into the 1980s or something. I mean, they found agreement with each other. They talked in specifics about what they were going to try and do. I mean, it strikes me, which is a wild thing to understand or realize, that the running mate candidates in this race seem to have a much better grasp of the policy issues than the people whose ticket they're running on. I mean, that's a wild thing to think, and it's usually not the case, but it seemed very apparent to me, and I appreciate the fact that they were cordial with each other. I mean, I don't think that's a necessity. Sometimes we vehemently disagree, and it's okay to say that and do that. But it was elucidating. I mean, I left feeling like I better understood the policy positions of both the tickets, and there were moments that were, you know, genuinely illuminating, like, you know, Tim Walz not being able to explain the reasons that he has said things publicly that are untrue other than calling himself a knucklehead. J.D. Vance not being able to say that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election, which was maybe the most revealing part of the night. And then all the policy debates that actually happened in the middle. Now, do I think the CNN moderators were, unbiased? No, I think it was clear they were more prepared, again, for some of the things J.D. Vance was saying. I think the first half of the debate, their questions for Vance were much sharper. But at the end, when it was all said and done, I did feel a lot more comfortable with the job that they did and how they kind of navigated the conversation.
Well, we're going to take another break here. When we come back, we're going to talk to Isaac Saul. And remember, check out his website and newsletter at Tangle, which is a spectacular product. And we're going to talk a little bit about why is it that journalists all bend so far to the left.
This podcast is brought to you by the American Property Owners Alliance. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that protects property owners and their interests. Did you know that in 10 states and Washington, D.C., the government can take more than what it is owed in property taxes in the instance of a foreclosure? From 2014 to 2021, 8,600 homes and more than $780 million in savings were lost to this practice, known as home equity theft. We are working to end home equity theft everywhere it remains on the books. Visit PropertyOwnersAlliance.org to join the effort to protect property rights.
Hey, welcome back, gang in the middle, my fellow political orphans. Great discussion about the news business and about a wonderful publication called Tangle you should check out, rated by All Sides, which rates media bias as being dead center. And friends always ask me, what should I read for my news? And the answer is usually I say, well, read a little bit of everything. Read the Wall Street Journal, read the New York Times, listen to the BBC if you can. You'll sort of get a sense, I think, if you just do an assortment of opinions. He actually does it for you. And that's what he and his editors do on a regular basis. So, it's interesting to me, if you look at Nate Silver, pollster for the New York Times, now off on his own and still does some great political reporting. did a survey of journalists that said only 5% self-identify as Republicans. If you saw the NPR scandal earlier this year, one of their senior editors was able to check the party registration for people because it's public record in Washington and Virginia. And there were 93 registered Democrats in the NPR newsroom and not a single Republican. And the one I really like is this is a thing that Politico did a few years ago with Jack Schaefer, who's an old buddy of mine when I used to write for him when he was the editor at City Paper in Washington. And Jack said, listen to this quote, 90% of all internet publishing company employees work in a county where Clinton won, and 75% of them work in a county that she'd won by more than 30 percentage points. And when you add in the shrinking number of newspaper jobs, 72% of all publishing or newspaper employees work in a county that Hillary Clinton won. So It's a cultural bubble, and it interests me. And I'm still on the board of visitors at Northwestern, and I have this regular, it's like, here goes Scott again on one of his rants, but there's a focus on diversity, right? And rightfully so at universities to make sure you've got a representative set of the student body, and it's not just a whole group of folks who came out as getting a free pass because they were legacy candidates where their parents had gone to the school. But the lack of really philosophical diversity and government philosophy in our nation's newsroom. And Isaac, do you have any sense why that is?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, first of all, Jack Schaefer obviously is a legend in the industry, somebody who I admire and look up to. I don't know him personally, but I had not heard that study or review that he had done. I will say Nate Silver's numbers, the 5%, are very consistent with other studies that have been done on the media industry. I know one famous one from 2013 or 2014 done by a pair of Indiana University professors found that 7% of journalists identified as Republicans. So pretty much something right in the same ballpark. I think there are a few things at play. I mean, first of all, I mentioned, in talking about Bucks County, the kind of the education gap that exists among the way people are politically affiliated. And, most journalists, in order to get a job in the media, you have to have a degree, and oftentimes a graduate degree that's either in journalism or in nonfiction writing or something like that. And that limits the pool of people that I think come into the space. In the old days, I would say there were many more reporters who were people that, didn't necessarily have a college degree, who liked the work and liked writing and came to it by going out and doing their own reporting and sort of hitting the streets and then using the stuff and the content they had produced to go get jobs. They were people from towns, cities, who knew the towns well and had some skills and had connections and knew how to talk to people, and they could translate that into journalism work. I think there's a lot of journalism and reporting that's a craft and you need to learn to do it, but I don't think you need a college degree to do it. I don't think you need to go spend 4 years at university to do it. I think you can be trained to do it and taught to do it by working in a newsroom. And I think some of the most important skills have nothing to do with things that you can learn at college. They're being able to develop sources. They're being able to talk to people. They're knowing a certain town or city or part of the country really well, or having a beat. Some of the best journalists who are industry specific have come from those industries. They're, former farmers who are now agriculture reporters because they understand the industry intimately. But we don't hire that way. We hire people who come from really prestigious J schools, who go to Ivy League colleges, who have connections, And the other sort of part of this is that journalism is not a very well-paid industry most of the time. And we, as an institution, tend to bring in people who, will take unpaid internships or low-wage jobs early on in their careers, which means that we often get a lot of people who come from families that are well off and can afford to do that kind of thing. And that limits the pool even further. So you're not just getting highly educated people, but you're getting highly educated, wealthy people. I know my first job at the Huffington Post, I got paid $38,000 a year for a full-time job. in New York City. So the only reason I was able to do it was because the first year I was working there, I lived with my mom in Philadelphia, and I commuted every day from Bucks County to the office at Huffington Post, which was a 2-hour door-to-door commute. So I spent 4 hours on a train, and I got paid $38,000 a year. And I did that for a year, and that's how I got off the ground. And it's just not easy to do that for a lot of people. So there are all different reasons that it's, inaccessible, I think, to a more diverse makeup of people, not just politically, but financially as well. And then, everybody hires people they know, which is another problem too.
But I'm going to we've only got about 2 minutes left. I want to make a point though, too, that I think folks who go into journalism often have this sort of sense of outrage that they want to, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, or whatever the old line was from Mencken. And so I think they come in and say, here's a problem, we have to solve it. My problem is that in most cases, it's creating another government program or hiring more government bureaucrats. I did a story years ago when I was first working in TV in Seattle about the Washington State Medical Disciplinary Board, which took a look at doctors who sold drugs, sexually assaulted patients, were incompetent, and everything else in the world. So I got asked to come down to Olympia to testify about this reporting I did. And they said, this is great. We're going to hire 8 more investigators, and we're going to double this staff and hire attorney generals who do this. And it's like, you don't need to do any of those things. You just have to have people who actually act. You don't need any more bureaucracy. I found this as some guy 2 years out of journalism school who ended up finding all these records of doctors who'd killed people, and you didn't even have files opened on them. So anyway, that's a discussion for another day. So give me your sense on the Senate race in Pennsylvania in the last 30 seconds.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, it's like most races that are happening in swing states, I think Democrats are at a heavy advantage. And I think it's an undertold story of this election about the gap between Kamala Harris and a lot of the Democratic senators who are running ahead of her. So I expect Democrats to hold the seat. I am surprised more people aren't talking about this gap that exists in Arizona and, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, but it's going to be tight like most of the races are.
So one more reminder, Isaac Saul, the editor, creator of Tangle, you owe it to yourself to check it out on the web. Terrific publication, smart guy. We admire people we admire entrepreneurs, and no business is tougher these days in the news business. So thanks, Isaac. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
If you like this episode of Lost in the Middle, please remember to subscribe to our podcast. And if you enjoyed it, please tell your friends and pals.